So Queen's Gambit came out on Netflix and you still haven't came around to watching it and you want to have an appreciation of quote the greatest game ever played unquote, but it's a bunch of people around a game board respecting the nature like it's open heart surgery and you're just sitting there like I played this whenever I was 12. I don't even know what the bishop does. In this presentation, I'm going to try and give a very novice, not really novice, a observer's introduction into high-level chess play, the thought process, the straight rules, how information is shared and how games are shared, and hopefully briefly touch on openings and theory and motivate you to go check this stuff out for yourself. And there is a lot more information to cover than I can in just 7 minutes, so it feels wrong to try and talk about theory and openings. And so I'm just going to try and explain how to play and some general strategies to these pieces. Chess is a turn-based board game simulating a formation-style encounter of two armies, black-white, played on an 8x8 grid where each turn a player can move one of their 16 pieces with the goal to capture the enemy king piece. The first 8 of the 16 pieces for each player consist of one king, one queen, two bishops, two knights, and two rooks. The second half of both players' army consists of 8 pawns. The first rank of white player are the closest squares to the white player when the game begins. The closest squares are A1, and then reading left to right ends on H1. The first rank of the black player begins on the square H8 and ends on the square A8. So the second rank of white player begins on A2 and ends on H2. The second rank of black player, where you put the 8 pawns, the second half of your army begins on H7 and ends on A7. So by that logic, the fourth rank of white, A4 through H4, is the fifth rank of black, H4 to A4. It's the same thing, but you read it left to right in respect to the player. So the 8 rows of this 8x8 grid are considered ranks, and the horizontal columns of this 8x8 grid are considered files. The A file for white is on the leftmost, and the A file for black is on the rightmost. And when you are setting up your pieces on the first rank when beginning the game, it reads for white, rook, knight, bishop, queen, king, bishop, knight, rook. Well, for black, it's very similar, but you switch the king and the queen so that now A through D file is the queen side for both players. The queen is on the left it is on the fourth left of the 4 on 8 because there's not a middle one, it's on the 4 left. And for black, it is on the 4 right. So that means it is on the right 4. And now by this logic, A through D file is the queen side, and E through H file is the king side. So now whenever I say queen pawn for white, that is the D2 pawn. And queen pawn is the same for both players on the D file. So pawns are by far the most difficult piece to understand because they have a difference in moving and attacking. They are the only piece with this. Every other piece can attack as they move. Their movement is their attack. If you move your piece to a square that has a enemy piece on it, you take that piece. But for pawns, they cannot move into a piece that has an enemy piece in front of it. For example, on the G file, white pawn cannot move forward into black pawn, but this is the special thing about pawns, they attack diagonally. So the pawns on the E file and G file have a blue square diagonally of them because they can attack because there is a pawn there. If there was not a pawn there, they cannot move there diagonally, and because there is a black pawn in front of white pawn, it cannot move forward. The green squares represent movement. The first move that a white pawn can make can be 2 squares forward. After the first move of a of each pawn, all 8 pawns have the ability to move 2 squares forward on their first move. But after that, they can only move 1 square forward. If you move 1 square forward on your first movement of a pawn, you cannot move it 2 squares, yielding 3 squares out of 2 moves from the white pawn. A pawn can only make forward movement by going forward or by attacking diagonally. A pawn cannot move backward, and it cannot move to the side. If a pawn moves enough into your enemy's rank to reach the first rank, to reach the farthest square from your position, that pawn can actually be traded for another piece. So that is the dynamic of pawns. They are the best and they are the worst. Once they reach the other side of your opponent, they can be traded for a queen. If your opponent has taken your queen, you can trade your pawn for a queen, which is the typical shot if you have your queen lost, but you can trade it for any others. And this is the power of pawns. The king, the object of the game. The name of the game is to align your pieces into attack on this king. So to do this in the nature of a turn-based game, you only get one move. You cannot attack the king, and you cannot get ready to attack the king and attack the king on the same move. You have to do that in 2 moves. Well, in between that, there's a concept called check. If you set up a piece to attack the king, the next move that your opponent makes, because their king is about to be attacked, this is called check. They have to move their piece to not get checkmate. The name checkmate means that even if you move your king, that square is protected by another piece that I've set up for this encounter that we're in right now. This is dynamic. This is the dynamic of chess. Checkmate. It is check versus checkmate. If you get a piece ready to attack the king, but it's simply a check, you only made your opponent move the king or set up a way to answer the call that you just asked for the check. So there's a difference in check and checkmate, and the king simply can only move 1 square per move if you choose to move the king piece, or if you have to move the king out of check because your opponent does not have a checkmate. A checkmate means that you have lost. Means that even if you move your king, even with your next move, you lose. And there's a concept where people understand that they have lost many moves in the future, to where you might not understand that this is actually a checkmate. It doesn't matter what happens, every encounter, every move that is going to happen in the next 3 moves, the only move to do are these set amount of moves, because you're in check for the next 4 moves. You have lost. And this is why people stand up and resign and shake hands whenever the board looks like it could still be played. No, actually, they are just 5 moves ahead, where in fact the square is taken and the facets and the possibilities are accounted for by my opponent. And you, as a player, respectfully resign, and you are playing at this level of chess to where you are on the same pattern as him, and you are all understanding what is about to happen, and it is a mutual, okay, no reason to continue. From the most complicated to the most important, now to the most powerful. The queen piece is the most powerful piece on the chessboard. It has the most movement options, as it can move perpendicular and as well on the diagonal. The second chessboard on this slide is showing a opening that white can do called the Queen's Gambit. It is called a gambit because white is appearing to sacrifice the c-pawn by showing white pawn to c4, as black has answered pawn to d4, which is white's best move, white's best first move. The c4 pawn is actually a gambit, and if black accepts, this is called a Queen's Gambit accepted, and this is where black's pawn on d5 chooses to attack the c4 pawn, which then is your queen pawn. Black has accepted sacrificing their black pawn, which is a disadvantage. Each player begins the game with 2 bishops either side of their king and queen. For white side, this means that they are on the c1 and f1 square. They can move across the entire game board on their diagonals, and the strategy is to open up your second rank in the position where your bishop's movement is to where you can achieve their influence on the entire game board as soon as possible. Each player begins the game with 2 rooks on the endmosts of their first ranks. The rook moves in a north, south, east, west perpendicular pattern. Rooks are more famously a late game piece, as they are very strong and can hold entire files, but are hard to engage and have other moves before them to open them up and to set them up and to get them on a file to have value out of it being on that file. That typically starts to be a factor later in the game whenever pieces are missing and there's open lanes and files. Since no piece can move through another friendly piece except for the knight whenever it is making its movement, no piece can go through another, so a piece that is in the corner will have to wait at least 3 turns until the rook can be moved. The knight is personally my favorite chess piece because I feel like it captures the nature of chess the most, and as well it can be next to pieces like the pawn and still be interactable. It does not need files or lanes or diagonals open for it to move around chess pieces in the nature of how it moves. It has to move 2 squares perpendicular of itself, northeast, southwest, before it can make its attacking move. These pawns can be in the way of a knight, and the knight can go over them. Any piece can be in the way of a knight, and it will move. This is the nature of the knight. The knight is what you want to invoke foremost after your pawns have moved up a rank or 2. Another strategy is to open up the bishops, but typical game strategy is to have the knights control the middle so that they can have valuable interactions and come back, because the only piece that has to move forward if it makes movement is the pawn. And so by this logic, the knight is very good at going in, getting value, and if your opponent does not answer, come back out. He can go across the entire map without asking your fellow pieces to have an entire move to make room for them to move, like what would happen with a bishop, rook, queen. The knight can go over them just by the nature of its moves, and its moves, as you see, have to, like the blue squares, are the ones that they can attack. But first, the darker yellow has to happen. It has to move in a north, south, east, west, L direction of 2 squares, and then it can make its attacking position. So yeah, that's a brief introduction into the game of chess. I tried to get as much information as possible in the 7 minutes, but if I were to go more information, I had more, but it just felt too long, and it felt wrong to add information without having premise information of how to play. And I shared one example of openings to kind of share what the Queen's Gambit is, and yeah, hopefully you understand what queen side and king side is. We know what files are. We know how to read the board. We understand that the 5th rank of white is the 4th rank of black, and vice versa there. We know how the chess pieces move, and hopefully you want to look more into this, because I mean there's just so much information out. Games have been recorded since the 14th century, and since then games have just been getting better, and there's all these different formations and patterns that happen whenever you're playing. And
to watch someone go through it and explain it is just super super entertaining. And yeah, I hope I gave enough decorum and respect to the level of entertainment and intelligence that it takes to play at chess at this level. I would recommend looking at Gotham Chess. This is the person that I watch, and this is where some of this information came from, and these strategies that I were sharing about. I was sharing about the pieces I got from him, and chess.com is the greatest library of information on chess. Some of the stuff is a paid subscription, but a good chunk of all the information is free to look up. And with that, I hope you enjoyed.